Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for attending tonight. My name is Abby Schumacher, and I am a school garden educator here with Seed St. Louis. Joining me is Dean. He is our programs officer. He mostly does community education. Do you want to say anything else about what you do?
Well, I don't know. I do all sorts of stuff. But yeah, in terms of this capacity, I mostly do kind of adult-focused kind of community education. We're partnering with Abby because a lot of the stuff we're going to talk about tonight can be applicable to both, or can be applicable to community gardens, or backyard gardeners that just have children, maybe not specifically school. And so we're gonna
hopefully what we'll be talking about tonight is something that could apply to not only like a school garden, educators in a school garden, but parents, caregivers, really anybody that works with youth, engaging youth in sustainability projects and in gardens. So get into the next slide here on a new device.
There we go.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So obviously the problem is everything going on with our climate, right? Like take your pick. So many issues, so many problems. I'm not going to list them all here. But we're dealing with climate change, and more than that, we're dealing with disruptions. And we're dealing with ultimately a climate crisis and a climate catastrophe. This is like the future ahead of us, basically. And so our main question tonight, in the words of David Sobel, is what's the most effective way to parent and educate children so that they will grow up to behave in environmentally sustainable ways? David Sobel is an education writer. He helped to develop and popularize something called place-based education, which I will talk about a little bit later. He wrote the book Beyond Ecophobia. Now it's pretty old. That was published, I think, in 1996, but he has some newer books out as well. And he deals with this question, maybe in kind of a surprising way. So we'll get to that. Okay. So one of the arguments that he makes, and I'm also going to link, I've got a bunch of like links set up in this presentation. So when it's sent out to you, you should be able to click on those links and find all of these resources that we're using tonight. So one of the things that he discusses is that environmental education needs to include hands-on experience, not just systematic knowledge, not just a giving of information and facts and knowledge, but a hands-on approach. And in the education world, some people refer to this as project-based learning as well. So this idea that you're dealing with real-world problems, it's a learner-centered approach that really engages student interests. You're taking on authentic investigations in the real world. So what better place to do that than the garden? For young children between the ages of 6 and 12, learning about is less important than actually being immersed in, specifically when we're talking about environmental education. There we go. Learning how to go to the next slide here. Okay. So the garden is a great place to do that. It's a great place to, in a very hands-on way, experientially learn weather and climate, cycles and seasons, resources, conservation, food systems, chains, webs, biodiversity. You can learn all of these things in a hands-on way in the garden. And Dean's going to start us off by really discussing like how you can engage youth in sustainability education by not only how you like design your garden and what you plant, but how you can like reuse things in your garden and kind of engage all of this sustainability education outside.
Yeah, and of course jump in if
Yeah.
you're going to. But yeah, so we're going to just talk about kind of some general sustainable gardening kind of practices in terms of design and stuff. And so one of the first ones is, when you're talking about creating a sustainable garden, and one that's relatively low maintenance and it's kind of easy to engage with and work with, is you want to make sure that you have the right plant for your site. So one of that is you want to pick a good site in general. So, for most garden plants, that means like not overly wet, a relatively good soil, not like real rocky and heavy clay, but, like some nice organic matter, or, you're bringing in some good soil if you need to, but, like a relatively good site, usually, particularly if we're talking about food production, that's also going to mean quite a bit of sun. And then you want to pick a plant that is well adapted to your location. So, growing a banana, maybe not the best option, at least outside. So picking something that really, does well kind of in the St. Louis region, and is also going to do well in that specific site. So if you have a location that is rocky and pretty clayey, that's probably not going to be good for vegetables, but it might be good for some of our native plants that maybe can handle more kind of rocky clay soils, or just some other plant that will tolerate those conditions. So really kind of working with what you have to pick those plants that will work in the location that you have. And then also just planting the plant well. So getting it off to a good start. So this means when you're planting like a potted thing, generally speaking, like a lot of times people think that you need to dig like the hole like extra big for the pot. And it can be helpful to dig the hole wider than the pot for sure, but you don't need it any deeper than the pot that you're planting. So making a nice wide hole, but not necessarily deep. If you're talking about perennial, trees, shrubs, vines, things like that, you're just going to backfill with the same soil that came out of the hole. If you're like in a vegetable garden, like raised bed or something, you could, like more annuals, you could put, something like compost or amendments into the hole, but generally for perennials, that's not needed, or even necessarily helpful. And then you're going to want to water it. Right after you plant anything, it should be watered, like really well that first time. And then you want to water it pretty regularly, especially for that, first couple months to a year of it getting established. And then protect from herbivores. So, if you're talking about, vegetable gardens, like things like rabbits or deer are going to want to eat your plants. So protect them from that. Trees, things like, again, deer or voles will want to kind of go up and kind of munch on the bark, eat the leaves. So, protecting them from those things. And then also, in the same idea of like starting with the right plant, a big thing if you're talking about wanting to be successful, wanting it to be easy, which is always great, especially if you're like growing with anyone, but particularly if you're growing with kids, to like actually have some success, is to pick things that are, again, like well adapted. And that can mean disease resistance. So particularly if we're talking about like fruit or nut plantings, this is a huge thing, but it's also a thing with some vegetables, that there are just certain diseases that are like constant pressures on some of these crops. And so picking things that are disease resistant can make your life much easier. And some of the best ways to find those, or you can find them in terms of plant descriptions, but also seeking out plants that have been trialed in our area. So that's one of the things that we do here. But you can also look for plants that have grown in similar climates. So, if you're looking for a tomato that will withstand the heat, then looking at a plant description from Maine that says will withstand heat is not going to be super helpful. But if you find something from Virginia that says survives the heat, which has a relatively similar climate to us, that's much more helpful information. So the varieties and cultivars that we carry, either through our seedling sales, the seed sales that we do, or just that we're recommending by name, are ones that we have tried here in St. Louis and have done well for us here. So those are good ones to start with. And then also, an important part of having the right plant is also planting it at the appropriate time. And we have this planting calendar that we update annually that is available for free on the homepage of our website, that also will give you good indications of when to plant things. Because even if you have a good plant, it's in the right spot, but you plant it at the wrong time, it might still be, weak and sick and like more likely to have issues than if it's planted at the appropriate time. So it's also good to know about those things.
And one reason I would also say it's so like critical to get started in the right way, like with the right plant at the right time. Why all of this is so important is because it's really key to like an organic garden, for example. Like if you don't want to be using, any like pesticides or herbicides or dealing with any of that stuff down the road, it's really important to get off to the right start. So all of this is super key to maintaining a sustainable and organic garden.
Yes, and that was a great point that I didn't bring up. But as an example of that I always give to show how important this can really be, grapes are one thing that have a lot of fungal issues in our climate. And I was speaking with someone who works with some grape growers in the region. And they said that the grapes that we're growing that were not disease resistant, like the conventional, like well-known European grapes, we're spraying their grapes 20 to 30 times a year just with fungicides to get like a commercially harvestable crop. Whereas those that we're growing, the more naturally disease resistant grapes, we're spraying them 2 to 3 times a year. And that's for a commercial crop. So if they are spraying them 2 to 3 times to get like a commercially perfect looking crop, you could probably not spray them at all on like a small backyard or school or community scale and still get a perfectly fine crop to use for your own uses. So yeah, just those genetics and starting with the right plant can just make your life so much easier, so much easier, and more sustainable as well. The arrows are working now. Oh, no, they weren't working before. So another big thing that kind of fits with starting with the right plant, but is really kind of thinking beyond the individual plant and thinking about more the system, is diversity. So diversity is really critical to creating a sustainable garden. Like in biology, and biology includes just about everything, diversity is really kind of the key to strength. Like systems that are more diverse are more resilient, they're more able to take stressors, they're more reliable generally, particularly as our weather is kind of more and more unpredictable, and spring will come early and then summer will come late, and then like it's all over the place. Having a diversity of plants there, it makes it much more likely that you will at least have something of interest, whether that's to eat or to teach with or to just observe at all times. Versus if you just have one or two things and then like a frost comes at the wrong time, well, you're just out of luck until next year. So having diversity is really important. And there are really 4 types of diversity, and I can't go too much into all of these, but there's 4 types of diversity that I think are important to talk about, particularly when we're talking about food crops. And one of those is varietal. So in fruit trees are kind of the most extreme example, but if you think of apples, and you think, well, I'm going to plant 3 different, 3 apples, and you plant all the same cultivar. Don't do that, but if you did that, for cultivars, they're actually all clones of each other. So if you plant 3 Red Delicious, genetically, it's actually just one plant that you're planting, essentially. Like from a disease standpoint, from a pest standpoint, it's all actually the same genetics. And so you really only have one plant. And so that's not any diversity, really. Versus if you're going to plant 3 apples and you plant 1 Golden Delicious, 1 Red Delicious, and 1 Fuji, then you have much more diversity in the gene pool in that regard. And there might be instances where a certain pest or a certain disease will hit one of those, but not others. And one example of this is Japanese beetles. So Japanese beetles will attack apples, but there's like one apple called Liberty that's a phenomenal apple, but Japanese beetles absolutely love it. And I've seen like in orchards where there'll be, a Liberty, an Enterprise, and a Red Delicious planted next to each other, and the Liberty will have bug holes all over it, and the other 2 will look perfectly fine. And so having, multiple ones there can bring that kind of varietal diversity. But beyond varietal diversity, there's also species diversity. So, instead of, if you're going to plant 3 trees, instead of just doing 3 apples, maybe you do 2 apples and 1 peach. And then you're bringing more diversity. And again, in terms of sustainability and resilience, there might be a disease that comes in really bad one year, like fire blight, that will attack the apples, but will not attack the peaches. Or you could have something that will attack the peaches, but not the apples. And so you're more likely to have fewer problems, like kind of with that kind of species diversity, because there's some things that will bother some and not the others. Another one that is really important, again, when we're talking about food, is familial diversity. So this is one that doesn't get talked about a whole lot, but much of our food plants are really only in a handful of plant families. So like kind of the most extreme example of this is in the fruit world. Almost all fruit is actually in one plant family, which is the Rosaceae family. And you can look, these flowers down here, these flowers are, I'm assuming, if, at least to me, they all look very similar. And that's because generally plants that are in the same family have the same reproductive structures or very similar. So like anything that's in like the pea family, the flowers are the same structure, which is why like a redbud flower actually looks very similar to a pea flower, even though those plants look nothing alike, but they're actually closely related. So these, just to show you how, wide this Rosaceae family goes. This up here on the left, this is an almond bloom. This right here is an apricot bloom. This is a blackberry bloom, and this is a strawberry bloom. Those are all in the same family. There are certain pests and diseases that will attack multiple or all of these, but will not attack things outside of that Rosaceae family. So again, as you're just kind of thinking in terms of diversity, like getting lots of different varieties, also doing lots of species, but also maybe thinking about doing things even broader than that in terms of family. So a great example of that is this flower up here, which again, if you look, doesn't look much like these others. It's got different structure. The color's very different. There's a lot more petals on here. This is a pawpaw flower. Pawpaws are not related to anything else that we grow. And so there are no pests or diseases that will attack a pawpaw that will also attack these other fruit. So if you have, a lot of these Rosaceae, but you also have some pawpaw, even if you have awful issues on all your Rosaceae, the pawpaw is still probably going to be fine. So again, just having that more diversity, that kind of broader diversity in terms of families can really increase the sustainability and the resilience of your crops. And this goes to vegetables as well. We have a little bit more diversity in vegetable families, but most of our vegetables actually still fall within about 4 or 5 families. So there's the alliums, which is all like onions, leeks, garlics, potato onions, like all of those are one family. The Solanaceae family, which is tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, potatoes, tomatillos, ground cherries, those are all in one family. The bean and pea family, which is all the beans, peas, all the legumes, and then the brassica family is all your cabbage, kale, collards, Brussels sprouts, radishes, mustard, turnips. Those are all the same family, and so just those 4, and then a 5th one being the squash family. So all your squash, pumpkins, melons, gourds, cucumbers, those are all in the same family too. And so just those 5 includes almost all of the conventional vegetables. So thinking about things that are outside of those families, like okra or sweet potatoes, those, if you have grown those before, they don't really have any pests or diseases. And partially that's because they're not related to anything else really that we're growing. And so looking for some more of that diversity can be helpful. And then lastly, geographical diversity. And this can be a little hard, particularly in kind of small urban lots, but this is just the idea of more mixing things. And it doesn't have to be extreme. You don't have to have a huge amount of space, but just the idea of if I'm going to plant 10 tomato plants and I have 10 beds, instead of just packing them all right next to each other, maybe mixing them in and doing, 2 here and a couple over there and kind of spreading them out a little bit so that if there's a pest, they're less likely to move and attack all of the tomatoes, is the idea of the geographical diversity. And just to, drive it home here, maximizing diversity in as many of these categories as possible, and ideally all 4 categories, will greatly increase the resilience of your garden and will greatly reduce the pest and disease pressure that you have, the total pest and disease pressure that you have in your garden, and just make it more likely that you're going to have at least some successes, even if you have a really hard year, which we're having more and more hard years. And then also thinking, and this is particularly where it's really fun, I think in general, but particularly with kids, is also just thinking about like the ecosystems, which is what our gardens are. They're agro ecosystems. They go beyond just the plants. So remember, not everything in the garden, not everything you plant, not everything you do needs to directly feed you. It doesn't need to just exclusively be about the plants that produce food. I imagine, and it says orchard in here, but I imagine your orchard and garden. You also want to feed, provide shelter, and provide places to lay eggs for things like pollinators and predatory insects, and maybe to repel pest insects, and also to provide nutrients for the plants that you want. And also, I imagine you want it to look pretty, like to also be beautiful. And there's a lot of ways to do that. Some of the easiest ones that kind of hit many of those all at once are just planting some of these other plants that can have beneficial uses, not things that you're going to directly eat necessarily, but other things that are going to be beautiful and provide habitat and provide nutrients to your plants. And the way you do that is, one, plant flowering things, the things that we all like anyways because they're pretty, and the things that are going to have the biggest kind of bang for your buck in terms of having the most multi-purpose plants are going to be things that will plant things that will have a long bloom period, plant things so that you have as long of a total bloom in your garden as possible. So like as many weeks out of the month that there was something flowering, the better. And ideally the individual flowers will be little. So, something like this looks like, one big flower, but if you look at it, it's actually a lot of little tiny flowers. And this can be good in terms of observation and figuring out, like, is this one big flower or, a lot of little flowers? Those are going to be really helpful because the predatory and parasitic insects, like this wonderful parasitic wasp up here, when they don't have insects to feed on, they're feeding on nectar and pollen. But their mouth parts are not made to do that. And so these little flowers are much easier for them to get the nectar and pollen out of than like a big intricate flower. It can also be helpful to plant nitrogen fixing things. So these can be things like clover, kind of around trees and shrubs, or like nitrogen fixing shrubs. That's really more for orchard plantings than direct garden. And then also deep rooted plants. So again, particularly around like orchard plants, having things that are very deep rooted can be helpful in terms of bringing nutrients up from deeper soil profiles. But you can also integrate them into your garden as well, or use those deeply rooted things that are planted somewhere else as mulch for your plants to kind of bring those nutrients in. And then we'll get into, what is it, the 7 R's, I think that we're up to now, 7 of them.
More than reduce, reuse, recycle.
Yeah, it's so many now.
Other options, especially in a garden setting.
Yeah. So now we're just going to kind of go through some of those things you can do to increase sustainability with like specific ideas of things that you can do. So the first one would be kind of refuse. And there's a few things that we do like to refuse in the garden. So one is plastic, just in general. I think most of us know plastic is not the best. There are things that like there's just not really great alternatives for, but there are some things that there are alternatives for, and some that maybe you don't realize are plastics. So one is if you have ever used peat pellets, so like those little peat pellets, the like netting that's around the peat pellets is actually plastic. So when they tell you, oh, you can just stick it in your soil, you can, but like that doesn't actually break down. So try not to use those. Pots. So, I use lots of pots, and if you are going to use pots, like reused pots are definitely better. But you can also use soil blocks. So there's these kind of soil blocker things that you can literally just like make these little cubes. They hold together somehow. I don't really know how, but they do hold together, and it's a way that you don't need a pot at all, which is more sustainable, and that you don't need to, be using plastic, but also it's much cheaper. You don't need to buy pots all the time, which is great. And then another big one is mulching or weed suppression, which a lot of times, or increasingly, we use plastic for, weed fabrics and things like that, plastic mulches. But you don't have to do that. There's lots of other alternatives that are not plastics. You can use things like cardboard, fabric, or just mulch, which we'll get into in maybe the next slide, a couple slides. Another big one to refuse that a lot of people don't know about, as opposed to plastic, is peat. So peat is used in potting mixes and seed starting mixes a lot of times. And for a long time, it was really kind of the only feasible thing to use that was like widely available. But peat bogs, which is where they're mined from, this is a picture of kind of how it's harvested. So they kind of, kill off all of this stuff and then dry them and then like pump the water out and then start harvesting the peat. But peat bogs, these places where peat is mined from, are actually absolutely enormous carbon sinks, like natural carbon sinks. And the harvesting of the peat disrupts those ecosystems and leads to pretty large amounts of greenhouse gases off-gassing from those places. And you can just see the numbers here. So peat bogs cover 3% of land, but hold 30% of all soil carbon. So like quite a bit. It makes a lot more sense to conserve 3% of land to get 30% of the savings, as opposed to, the alternative, which would be much more land. And that equals more than all living plant life on the planet. Like that's how much carbon is in there. And the damaging of peat bogs annually is estimated to emit about 6% of total human greenhouse gas emissions. And if there's alternatives, why do that? And there are alternatives, which we'll get to. So if you can generally avoid using peat when you can, it's just a good kind of low-hanging fruit there. The next one after refuse would be reduce, so use less of something. So the main one here is water that we're going to talk about. So some of the best ways to do that are to water either at the beginning or the end of the day when it's cooler, but the sun is still up. You're not going to lose as much to evaporation. It's going to soak into the soil more deeply. And also target your watering. This is another big one. Like if you have a bed and you just have a couple little seedlings, you don't need to like water the whole garden. You can literally just water the individual seedlings. If you're watering all the empty soil, you're just watering weeds basically. And so like just target watering can also greatly reduce the amount of water that you're using. And then absolutely mulch. Mulch is a huge one. Covering your soil with mulch, which is like, this is some straw, but you can also use other things, is going to reduce the amount of water that is needed by your plants. It's going to keep your soil cooler, which will reduce the amount of water that your plants need, but also reduce evaporation from the soil. It's very useful. And then another big one that I think kind of fits into reduce is the next one, which is reuse. One of the biggest ways to reduce your total usage is to reuse what you already have. One of the big ones with reusing is save your own seeds. Seed saving is a big one. Many of your things can be collected from plants that you would otherwise compost. And again, is a really fun one, I think, for like observation, or I don't know if you want to speak to that, but there's a lot of things that you can kind of watch them kind of go through their life cycle and harvest, and it's not really reducing your total yield. Like, like when your lettuce, when it starts bolting and it's like not good to eat anymore, just leave it there for another week or two and you can harvest the seeds. Or you get green beans that start getting too tough, instead of just picking them off and throwing them away, just leave them on there till they're dry and you've got seeds. And we have a whole class about seed saving too, like if you want to know how to do that. So then recycle, so like using something for a different purpose than it was originally intended. So seed starting and potting, so like seed starting mixes and potting soil. Instead of peat, you can use coir, which is what this product is here, which is a waste product of the coconut harvest industry, or pine fines, which is a waste product of bark mulch production, and bark mulch production is a waste product from the timber production. So it's like a waste product of a waste product that you can then use to replace peat, which is an awful product. You can also use rice hulls instead of perlite. Perlite's the little like white styrofoam looking things that are in potting mixes. So rice hulls are, again, just a waste product of rice processing from the agricultural industry, and works just as well as perlite in my experience to kind of fluff up your seed starting mix. And then mulch, you can buy mulch, but you can also just reuse things that you already have. Like the dead leaves from your trees in the fall are, in my opinion, the best mulch for vegetable gardens. Your weeds, unless they're like really awful aggressive weeds, also make great mulch. And then straw is technically a waste product, although you usually have to buy it unless you have a wheat field. And then plant tags. So plant tags can really be made out of any old plastic for the most part. You can like cut up old pots from, from plants that you have. You can cut up old plastic bottles. You can cut up aluminum cans into little strips and then write on them. This is not a reuse, but grease pencils are what I always recommend for that. They work really well. They're like $2 at Lowe's, and they don't wash off, which is really nice, which is, I always find, the biggest problem with labeling plants. And another thing for recycling is containers. Anything that will hold soil, isn't poisonous, and can be made to have drainage holes can be a container for your plants. So that can be old pots. It can be baskets. It can be, like these kind of like tub-like things, with handles that you don't want anymore, or that broke on the bottom. Well, if it broke on the bottom, that's drainage. That's fine. It can be milk crates. This is a milk crate here that we just like threw a burlap bag in, filled it with soil, and we were growing, cucumbers in there. You can use old cutters. You can use old plastic bottles or glass bottles or whatever, as long as you can somehow get drainage in them. We've used old kiddie pools for pots before. Again, anything that is, not like poisonous, like you're not worried about like lead or, paint or something like that. You can use to fill with soil, but you do, again, want to make sure that there are drainage holes in it. You don't want to have something that does not have a way for excess water to flow out the bottom. And then another one is trellising. If you want to do trellising, again, there's lots of old things that you can reuse as trellises, and you can see the things on there that will all work. And then repair is, I think, the second to last R, the sixth one. So this is another big one, particularly with your tools, but also with like raised bed. Like if you have raised beds or compost bins, like repairing those instead of just getting a new one is a big thing. Actually, with the raised beds, I want to talk to like you community gardeners out there, and home gardeners too. But if you have raised beds, there was a study that was done recently that found that like the carbon emissions from urban gardening can actually be much higher than rural gardening and like large scale farming. And most of those carbon emissions came from raised beds and the soil that fills them. And so the longer you can make your raised bed last, the lower your like total carbon emissions and the more sustainable your spot. So like repairing those edges or like bracing those corners so that they last longer is a big one. But with your tools as well, you want to oil and sharpen your tools so that they last longer and that they work well. Like sharpening is very undervalued, particularly for things like hoes, which when you get them are not sharp. They do not sharpen them. They should be sharpened if you want them to work easily for you. Replacing broken handles instead of just buying a new one. You can buy replacement handles at a lot of places. If the tire goes flat on your wheelbarrow, you can replace the tire. They also make flat-free tires or flat-free wheels that just don't ever get flat, that work pretty well and are, I think, like $10 to put on there. If your hose end starts breaking, you can get little replacements to replace the end. If you get a hole in it, there's ways to cut out that middle, and they sell little kits to like splice those together. And then also when you're buying tools, look for ones that look like they are easy to fix. If you have pruners, they have pruners that you can buy where you can just replace the blade as opposed to having to throw the whole thing away and replace it. And the last one that I'm not going to get into a whole lot of detail for because we have many classes covering this topic, but is rot. So if it's any organic material, anything from your garden doesn't need to be going into the landfill. You can compost it. It will decompose. Anything that used to be alive will compost. Whether it's easy to do that or not depends. But generally speaking, animal products are a little harder. But anything that is coming out of the garden, any plant material, is very easy to compost. It's totally doable. And if you feel uncomfortable about it, check out one of our classes on composting specifically.
Cool. Thank you, Dean. Okay, since this slide is so distracting, let me go back for a second. So yeah, just in sum, gardens are a wonderful way to practice sustainability with youth, to allow young people to see real solutions to climate problems that are manageable and doable, that create community. So much learning can happen in all of these different ways. So much learning with like biodiversity, with composting, like you can take this in really a million different directions. In some, the point being like to plan an organic sustainable garden, like do your homework, right? Invite a bunch of friends. Yeah, and that's really the main message. And their gardens are great places to learn actual solutions to real climate problems in a digestible way for young people.
And I think to see that you can actually do something.
Yeah.
Like very hands-on, like you do something and these are the results, and it's like a constructive and beneficial thing, not just a less bad thing.
Yeah.
Which I think is a lot of times what we get caught in in like environmental stuff. It's just like
100%.
being less bad. But like in the garden, you can see like I planted this and I like helped shepherd like something to live and grow, and like it created food for these other organisms. Like you can actually be constructive.
Yeah. And those were all just like very little seeds for you to take with you. Each of those slides basically can be an entire class, and we have classes on them. So yeah, always feel free to reach out for more information about any of those things. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about the other problem that I think young people deal with. This is our friend anxiety from the movie Inside Out, the new one, the new emotion of adolescence, right? So this is the other problem, I think, for young people, where it's like, okay, here's this like broken world, basically. You're going to inherit it. You need to fix it. So what do we do about that? How do we engage youth in sustainability and caring about the environment when it's really like an anxiety producing problem? So a lot of environmental education tends to take this tack of like, you know, look at this, but don't touch it. Like nature is fragile. Nature needs to remain behind glass, like what David Sobel calls this museum mentality about nature. And, you know, nature can hurt you also, or, you know, we don't want to destroy anything. We want to be extra gentle and careful. And so, you know, in that way, sometimes environmental education can become the problem with creating like this distance between kids and nature. And so David Sobel argues that any kind of nature program should really encourage kids to like have fun, right? Get dirty, like experience nature in like a really gritty kind of whole body way, rather than remaining like disconnected from it. So what we're going for in this sense then is more, I would say, Magic School Bus, Miss Frizzle, seatbelts everyone, right? Like let's dig into it. Let's go on an adventure versus the Lorax, right? Like less of the Lorax, like, oh my God, like this is the problem that we're looking at. This is the scale of it. Let's, you know, reach out for experiential education and enjoyment and fun, rather than here's this like host of problems and, you know, now fix it. I also wanted to point out that one of the things that David Sobel talks about in an article that I'm going to link at the end of this presentation is the relationship between like childhood experiences and then growing up to be, we're going to move on just because my little movement slides are distracting, but good, right? So he talks about all this research that's been done on the relationship between childhood experiences and environmental values or careers or behaviors. And what most environmentalists or adults that have grown up to, you know, exhibit environmentally conscious behaviors and not just values, most of those people had two things. One being significant amounts of time outside in like wild space, and also an adult in their life that showed respect for nature. So those are really the two main things, more than like scouts or camps or environmental ed programs at school or clubs based on a specific environmental something. It was really just like freedom to explore and play outside in nature. So what we're also talking about is just connecting to nature, like teaching kids to like love a place and experience in a place before they're being asked to save it. Either way, they're going to be in this fight for a better climate and for a better world. So the more that they can do that from a place of love, basically, rather than being afraid or being anxious, the better. So how do we do that in gardens with young people? And I'm going to share a bunch of like tips with you on how we can do that. The first thing is fostering exploration and play. There's just sort of like limitless ways to do this. If we break this down, into ages, ages 4 to 7 are typically interested in like home, in feeling at home and kind of exploring what it feels like to be at home. And so anything that produces like a sense of empathy or like a closeness to home is good for that age group. For ages 8 to 11, they're more interested in like exploring landscapes. And then for ages 12 to 15, they're interested in gathering spaces. So there's lots of different ways to engage different ages in exploration and in play. So think of, for example, plant tents. You can do this with sunflowers, like you can see these are a couple of pages. I think you can see my little mouse there, a couple pages from different books that I have. These children down here are taking a rest in a bean tent. This grandmother's reading to her grandchild under a sunflower tent structure. So these are real things that you can build in the garden. Wonderful for children. Building little fairy gardens, right? Getting down to the size of something, like pretending to be ants or something very small like fairies, and really like getting down into that world and playing imaginative, fostering imagination. Fairy gardens are a great way to do that. Scavenger hunts are what I like to call treasure hunts, where children can actually interact with and collect things, find the things that are interesting to them. This little egg carton activity is a specific activity that comes from Life Lab. It's called 6 in 1, half a dozen in the other. You can just Google that and it'll give you the actual activity. But collecting things, searching for treasures, right? Making art from things that we find outside, all ways to engage the imagination and to play outside and to enjoy being outside. Trying to go to the next slide, which is hard for me. Okay. Okay, so more ways to explore and play. Theme gardens, specifically for school gardens. This can be really helpful. You can do them at home too, but doing only giant varieties of things, right, that make you feel small. So like giant sunflowers and giant pumpkins, doing miniature gardens where you have like tiny varieties of everything, right? And children can feel like a giant in the garden. Zoo gardens where you're incorporating plants with the names of different animals. Think catnip, think lamb's ear, have a bunch of plants like that. Recipe gardens like pizza and salsa and salad, like growing a bunch of things that you would use in a recipe, etc. If you would like more information about theme gardens, I can give it to you. There's lots of information out there about that. And then also something I stress to educators, anybody working with youth in a garden setting, like don't be afraid of mess. Welcome distractions. Build in time to just really slow down and let kids explore, to be distracted by what's around them, to ask questions about it. So much learning can happen in that way. Build an outdoor library. So there's a picture of Dean with a little free library outside. This is a great place to just like store your garden books, not just like books about gardening, but like storybooks for kids that feature like the natural world. A good way to engage kids in some space outside. Wonder walls are basically just like, as questions arise outside, you can like write it on a little post-it and find a spot to keep all of those questions that kind of arise as kids are exploring around the garden. So in addition to exploration and play, engage the senses. all of the senses, including listening too. There are certain plants that sort of like make different sounds in the garden, like grasses and stuff. But I was just doing a taste test with children the other day, and we did like a 5 senses exploration of little snap peas. And we like held them next to our ear and we tapped on it and we snapped them in half and talked about like how they, sound so fresh and so crisp. And so there's all different kinds of ways to really engage your whole body outside. And also one thing that David Sobel talks about is that, connecting with nature for young people is really more about like take and eat than it is about look and learn. So making sure to like take and consume and cook and build things out of what you can harvest in the garden to really make sure that kids are a part of harvesting, cooking, and eating. That's a great way to really like take gifts from the garden and experience them with your whole body. Let's see. Okay, so fostering compassionate attention. Because we're limited on time, I'll let you watch this on your own. It's only a few minutes. This is an excerpt from Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass. It's called The Honorable Harvest. So this is really a philosophy that comes to us from, she's Potawatomi, and it's really from her like indigenous roots, but I think that there are ways to like incorporate a lot of these things in the garden with kids to really foster this sense of like gratitude. So some of the things are like, she talks about asking a plant if you can like take from it first. One way that, might be more like appropriate to talk about that in another culture would be like, let's like make sure that this plant is actually ready to pick. Like, what are some signs that a plant is ready to be harvested? Like, let's double check our seed packet. Saying thank you to a plant or giving back to a plant can take the form of watering or fertilizing or adding some compost to a plant. So really fostering this sense of gratitude in the garden. It should just go to the next one. There we go. This is a great book to use to talk about how our food gets to our table and who all the people are that bring food to us. It's called Before We Eat, From Farm to Table. It's actually a pretty short book, good for small kids. Kids Gardening is a great organization that I would direct you to for a lot of like social and emotional learning that can happen in the garden, but they have 2 lessons in particular. One's called Thanks a Bunch and others called A Multitude of Gratitude. And those are about how to practice gratitude in the garden, how to engage kids and seeing the world around them really as a gift. Because when we think of things as gifts, it changes our relationship to them. And it causes us to want to take care of those things, right? So like something you buy at Target versus something that somebody made for you, you're probably going to take better care and pay more attention to the thing that somebody made for you because that was a gift. It wasn't just a commodity that you purchased. A really simple activity to do with young people in the garden is this activity called the 3 I's. I notice, I wonder, and it reminds me of. So you can really take anything that you find out in the garden, like everyone can have a leaf, same kind of leaf, different leaf, a stick, everybody take a stick, and really like have focused, like compassionate attention on one small thing. And you would be really amazed by all of the like conversation and questions that an activity like that can generate in this kind of structured way. Another way is through like scientific or what I would call like an alphabet drawing. This comes from an organization called Life Lab. where you're really looking deeply at a thing for a long time, and noticing all of its details. So making drawings, my son actually did this one. It's a drawing of a beet. So he's got like the long root and all the little hairs coming off of the long root, and all the purple veins in the leaves. So he had sustained attention on a beet for solid like 10 minutes just making this alphabet drawing. And then finally, I think gardens are a wonderful place to build community. And one way to do that is to have like a welcome sign at your garden or art in your garden that reflects your neighborhood. I love this welcome sign that I've shared because it's got like garden rules basically, but they're structured in a positive way. So, you know, instead of we're not going to pick and pull and crush and whatever, it's like, no, we're respectful. We're out here to take care of it. We are harvesters, we are safe. So formulating those like garden boundaries and like rules as positive commitments is a really good way to engage kids in taking some ownership of their garden space. Okay, so also engaging young people in like the building of a garden, the planning of a garden. So all of those things that Dean was talking about at the beginning, like kids can be a part of that process, kids of all ages. That's like a great thing actually for middle school and high school to really be like, okay, like what are plant families? Like what are the plants that I eat at home, and like really engaging them and developing those garden plans and building those garden infrastructure, like coming up with containers and trellises and like how to reuse materials, like really involving young people in being a part of the community. Sharing food is like a huge way to build community in the garden. Having animals in your garden, not just chickens, but bees and rabbits and worms, and you know, planting native plants for butterflies, and incorporating all these other creatures into our community as well, and giving kids ultimately a sense of place. And this is a whole other class in itself. I just wanted to put some resources out there for people. Again, David Sobel is one of the people that really popularized this idea of place-based education, using local ecology as a way to study a lot of different subjects and also interact with the local community. And the last thing that I'll share before maybe we take a couple of questions are just some of the resources that we were working with, that I was working with specifically to talk about how to just foster like enjoyment, play, gratitude, empowerment, like all these things about just like connecting with nature, forming a relationship with nature. These are all links, so hopefully if you're sent the presentation, you should be able to click on these and just read them. Naomi Klein's written this book that's really for like middle school, high school, adolescent age. It's a collection of different stories on climate activism and climate solutions. So it's really meant to be this like empowering, inspiring collection of tools and stories for how to deal with climate change and climate disasters. This organization, Tinker Garden, is really great at explaining why we do certain activities with kids. This article that I linked, Why the Power of Destruction is Really Good for Kids, is like, it's really short. It's kind of a fun read. A lot of the time when we're out in the garden with children, it's like, don't step on that, don't touch that, don't squish that bug, like, you know, this look, don't touch approach. But actually like destruction is a really good way for kids to like see the inner workings of things, or experience cause and effect, or sort of like locate themselves within this constantly like changing environment and world. So sometimes there's a place for that, and it can be appropriate in the garden, which is like this like free wild space to just like explore and play and build forts and make potions and like take stuff apart and be creative, and leave a little bit of a trace, not no trace, right? Is good for kids outside. Kids Gardening is a wonderful organization. And then these last two here are to learn more about place-based learning. So that's what we have for you tonight. I think we have a few minutes to take some questions. I know we threw like a lot of information out there in terms of how to engage young people in environmental consciousness and sustainability. So yeah, I think right now we have maybe one question hanging out.